This is Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. I'd like to welcome all of our Bloomberg television and radio audiences for an exclusive interview with Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella. Microsoft just kicked off its Inspire 2021 conference, unveiling a number of new products, including a cloud version of Windows for remote workers as the world continues to adapt to a hybrid working model. Satya Nadella joins us now live from Microsoft headquarters in Redmond, Washington. Satya, always good to have you back on the show. Thanks so much for joining us. Perhaps the biggest headline is you're offering a new delivery system for Windows, the ability to download your PC basically to any device from the cloud. Who's the target user here?
First of all, thank you so much, Emily, for having me. As you said, in the intro, it's a very exciting week for us. Our partner conference is something that I've grown up with all through my life at Microsoft. And it's a great reminder of, I think, what's unique and core to Microsoft. These 400,000 partners who are going to create 10 million plus jobs over the next 4 years. And for every dollar Microsoft makes, there's $10 that's made in the partner ecosystem. So it's a super important week. And as you said, in hybrid work, the real currency or the real need is more flexibility. That means more options for how to get to your software, your applications, your content, your files. And so we're very excited about this new category that we announced, which is the Cloud PC and Windows 365. So I think if, for example, we're all getting ready to welcome interns and a way for them to have a PC that now is available in the cloud. So that means it's easy to provision, easy to secure. If you even think about in the pandemic or the height of it, some of the software engineers, industrial engineers had real issues on productivity because they wanted access to the most sophisticated compute capabilities. And now they can have that in the cloud, and they can be working on their home computer or a corporation-issued computer, but they'll have access to all of the content they need. So we're very excited about the Cloud PC.
Now, I know you're focused, and you spoke about this at Inspire this morning, on giving your partners the most powerful technology and tools. You're also giving Teams customers more features, access to Dynamics 365. How does this all together fit into your vision of how we will be working differently a decade from now?
Yeah, I mean, one of the very exciting other announcements from this morning is if anything, the silos that exist, Emily, today between, I'll say, communications, collaboration, and business process have to come down. So the friction all has to be broken. And so that's what this new class of applications called collaboration applications that, in fact, many of them got built during the pandemic. People were building essentially the connections between Dynamics 365 or Power Apps, and Teams. And so what we did this morning was to announce that we're going to make that friction-free even from a licensing perspective. So I think it's going to really speak to the overall need of flexibility. When we did our own surveys with our employees, Emily, right now, we have 70-odd% people who say we want that human connection, and 70% who say we want flexibility. And that's the hybrid paradox. And so that means it requires structural change in how we think about people, process, as well as the place where hybrid work happens. And so we're well on our, we're working across all of those dimensions.
You're also cutting merchant fees from 20% to 3%, which is a pretty big change. How does that position Microsoft competitively?
I mean, we're very, very anchored as a platform company. Our job number 1, 2, and 3 is to create more opportunity for our partners of all forms. And so that means providing the best economics of any platform company out there. And that means when it comes to the marketplace, so the announcement that you referenced, whether it's the Azure Marketplace or AppSource, where a lot of the SaaS applications are there, we cut from what is in the industry standard 20% to 3%, where that means our partners can now take that surplus and invest in their own people, in their own IP, and create more opportunity for themselves. To me, that's the sort of core to being a great platform company, and we're very, very focused on that.
Now, the biggest debate happening in the business world right now is how to get workers back to work and what benefits to give your employees. Microsoft is asking employees to be back in the office 51% of the time, but you're flexible about the rest of the time. Is that a permanent policy? And for those companies that are saying you have to be back in the office 100% of the time, are they on the wrong side of history?
First of all, I think we at Microsoft, we want to be much more data-driven. I also think that In time, if a year from now, we will have more sense of what the real structural change and needs and the expectations of both our employees and our customers are. And we'll really think about long-term policies based on, quite frankly, having all of that data behind us, because otherwise I think we are trying to come up and being too overly dogmatic when I think we need to be more experimental in our approach to return to work, because I do fundamentally believe the world's changed. People expect, our employees expect more flexibility. As I said, 70% want more touch with others, but at the same time want flexibility. So that's why we need to, for example, on our tools, Emily, we are really making sure that we are going to be great at asynchronous, synchronous, remote and together communication. In the past, we could have probably gotten away with being good in one or two of those quadrants, but you now need to be world class at all the four quadrants. So when it comes to people, the policies around them, how we think about productivity broadly, how do we physically outfit even our conference rooms so that, for example, remote participants are not going to put up with anything other than a first-class experience. And so we are making sure that that's the features in Teams, cameras in conference rooms really allow us to do that. And then, this idea that, we used to talk about remote work or remote sales or remote service. Guess what? Going forward in a world of flexibility and hybrid, it's just going to be sales, support, and service. And we just need to just make the structural change to our operating model so that we accommodate for what I think are changed expectations and changed world.
All right. Now, the cloud obviously makes so many parts of business more seamless, but there are also concerns about so many key industries moving key data to the cloud, consolidated among such few companies. The Bank of England recently called out this problem, called out some of these companies for quote-unquote secrecy, for the concentration of too much power in the hands of too few. How concerned should we be about cloud security and the concentration of that power among the cloud giants like yourself?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of different dimensions to that. One is the security dimension. Ultimately, I think one of the most important things coming out of this pandemic, which needs to be a huge priority for all of us, is implementing zero trust architecture, whether it's at the infrastructure layer, the data layer, the application layer, or the identity layer. So there cannot be a more important thing, because as I always say, this is not even about sort of having the security technology. It's the operational security posture to recognize threats, see the threat before it becomes pervasive inside of your organization. So we're investing a lot, building a lot of technology, evangelizing, making sure our services are there to help the smallest of businesses to the largest of enterprises. So that's one dimension you reference. The other one, when it comes to quote-unquote concentration risk, I would say more than concentration risk, the biggest issue is sovereignty. The question every business needs to be asking is, first of all, whatever data I have, first of all, do I have control over my own data? Or is somebody leaking the value of my data to benefit themselves? That's, I think, more the bigger issue versus where is it residing? Is it in one cloud, the other cloud, or with me? I think it's more, do you have data sovereignty? We know it applies to nations, it applies to companies, and I think that's the bigger issue. And I think that, in fact, this morning, even at our keynote, I spoke about that.
Now, the scrutiny of big tech, meantime, is accelerating around the world. It's accelerating on Capitol Hill. And so far, Microsoft seems to have avoided most of the ire of U.S. lawmakers. You haven't had to testify on the Hill yet. Some of your opponents have told me they think that's because Microsoft is really good at lobbying. What's your response to that?
The fundamental thing that I think is being litigated out there is what are two sides to it. What technologies, as they scale, what are the unintended consequences for the broader society, whether it's privacy, whether it's ethics, whether it's cyber, what have you. So that's sort of one side, which the Congress and other legislative bodies and antitrust bodies are all looking at. And then the second one is competition. Where is there vigorous competition or lack thereof, or where are the policies of any platform provider or gatekeepers or aggregators prohibiting more competition? And quite frankly, on both those fronts, Microsoft is on the right side of history. We would every day get up and make sure that when we scale our platforms, we're making sure that things like privacy and things like security or AI ethics or internet safety are things that we invest in. And then when it comes to competition, I mean, you should go talk to the people who are investing a lot of capital, a lot of M&A, competing with Microsoft, and we welcome that. And as long as we both of those fronts we remain vibrant, we will continue to make progress while at the same time benefiting those who partner with us.
We are speaking to your competitors as well, I assure you. On that note, the pact you struck with Alphabet CEO Sundar Pichai back in 2015 recently expired. This pact to not lobby against each other. And the relationship, as we understand it, has been tense in recent days on a number of fronts. Are you concerned about returning to the acrimony of earlier years between Google and Microsoft? Have you talked it out with Sundar recently, or would you be open to that?
First of all, look, I mean, I have a lot of respect for what Alphabet and Google and Sundar and team have achieved and are doing. I mean, to us, we compete with them on many dimensions, right? Whether it's advertising, we're fighting the good fight to sort of compete against the colossal lead in that space, and we compete in the enterprise space every day. So therefore, we will promise you one thing, which is we'll compete vigorously and we'll cooperate with them. And if the question is, are we going to go do stuff which is not above board? No. We are going to absolutely be anything that we sort of have, which is an issue with Alphabet or Google, will be in the public domain with them and with others. And it's all about competing in the right way and cooperating in things that we both care about.
All right. Microsoft just hit a $2 trillion market cap. It is the second most valuable company in the world, next to Apple, $2.12 trillion to be exact, according to my Bloomberg terminal. How do you justify that, and where does the next $1 trillion of growth come from?
I mean, whatever success we've achieved and whatever success we achieve going forward, and especially in a week like this where we're sitting down with our partners, comes down, Emily, always back to me as to what market cap, quote unquote, we are creating around us. But one country, one community at a time, right? So that's why I always go back to even the statistics around these 400,000 partners, the 10 million jobs they create, the $10 they make for every dollar we make. And of course, in order to achieve all that, we have to be competitive. We have to be innovating. We have to invest in building a new modern platform across everything from infrastructure to business applications and everything in between. So as long as we do that, I think we're in good shape. We have a very competitive, I mean, think about it, right? Coming out of this pandemic, the most malleable resource out there for us to deal with any of the challenges, whether it's inflation, whether it's the need for more rapid digital transformation, it's all going to be software. And so I feel very well positioned. But at the end of the day, it'll come down to us creating not just the technology, but a business model that allows for broad success around us.
Now, cyber attacks, meantime, seem more frequent than ever. Microsoft has been a victim. Microsoft is responsible for protecting a lot of other companies and your partners. And I wonder, how would you describe the threat level right now? And if there's something keeping you up at night, is cyber it?
For sure. I mean, somebody described this to me, like while we have a pandemic, we have another real pandemic, which is cyber. And that's going to be there with us. But at the same time, I think what is really now much more, I think, in the consciousness of people is the level of attacks for sure have increased, but the need for our response to be top-notch has also increased. And so, for example, if you think about it, right, even the hygiene levels, the operational security hygiene levels, we just have to get better as an industry because we're only as good as the weakest link. If you think about supply chain attacks, that's sort of what they point to. It's not even about the largest of companies with sophisticated tools and manpower to do stuff, but it's about like, okay, what is the supply chain look like? And how do we make sure every small business which is part of our network is also secure? So I do think that this is an issue that's going to remain with us, but I feel fairly confident, quite honestly, right now, that we all can come together, share threat intelligence, improve the security posture, and make a real dent on whether it's ransomware on one side or even nation-state activity on the other side.
Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella, appreciate your optimism. Thank you so much for joining us here on Bloomberg Television and Radio. Now, investors are favoring big tech again, with the market value of the 5 biggest tech companies surging over $1 trillion since the start of June. Microsoft shares have made up a quarter of that move, hitting a record high today with its own market cap, as I said, over $2.1 trillion. Coming up, Chicago, taking a page from Silicon Valley's playbook as it looks to expand its tech scene. Mayor Lori Lightfoot joins us next to talk about her trip to the Bay Area and closing the climate gap between long-term goals and near-term action plans. We are going to speak with former Vice President Al Gore later this hour. This is Bloomberg. Chicago wants to become a top destination for tech talent, and to do that, they are taking a page out of the Silicon Valley playbook. Mayor Lori Lightfoot and a coalition of tech leaders visited San Francisco last week as part of their Come Back to Move Forward initiative, an effort to entice 10,000 employees who took tech jobs elsewhere to return to Chicago over the next 2 years. Joining us now, Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot. Mayor Lightfoot, thank you so much for joining us. Tell us about the Chicago tech ecosystem today. How robust is it? What are the biggest companies there that have a tech presence?
So we have a clearly tier one tech community, but part of the initiative and why we went to Silicon Valley is to make sure that we were raising awareness about that community. For example, just this year, we have 9 unicorn companies to date, which is a pretty remarkable accomplishment. But every industry that you can think of in our incredibly diverse economy, whether it's transportation, logistics, life sciences, food, fintech, there's a tech component that really is at the heart of the growth of all these industries. We've got the most female startups percentage in the country. So there's a lot of things that are on the move with us, great momentum, and we just got to do a better job of making sure that the rest of the country, and particularly VC investors on the coast, understands the vitality of our tech community.
So you launched a new initiative trying to get thousands of workers from Chicago to come back to Chicago. What's your pitch to someone who might be working at Google or Facebook or an up-and-coming startup in Silicon Valley to come home?
Well, I don't think it's a hard pitch, because I think through the pandemic, a lot of folks are thinking about where they want to be and whether they need to be in their present location. We just want to make sure that Chicago is part of those conversations. Whether it's a company that's looking to start someplace, we want Chicago to be top of mind. Whether it's looking at a second headquarters, Chicago should be one of the destinations, or tech talent that is located someplace else, we want them to think about and understand the vibrancy of the tech community here in Chicago, so they really think about us. So it's really those 3 tiers, startups, expansions, or workforce development. Chicago needs to be part of that conversation. And why? Because we've got a great, robust economy. We've got the lowest unemployment of any of the major cities. We've had 32 corporate relocations over the course of this last year. And these are companies that literally could choose anywhere in the world to locate. They're coming here because of the strength of our underlying economy. And when it comes to quality of life, you can still afford to buy a home in the city of Chicago. And I'll put our arts and culture and music scene and restaurant scene up against any city in the world. So we've got a lot of things going for us that make Chicago an incredibly important and attractive destination for tech companies and tech workers.
You certainly have Silicon Valley beat on home prices, I will give you that. You recently came to the Bay Area, you met with tech leaders. Who did you meet with and what did you learn?
Well, we learned a lot. We met with folks at Uber and Uber Freight. We met with people at Salesforce. And then we had a lot of discussions with VC investors and expats from Chicago. And I think we've learned a couple of things. One is we've got to do a better job of really highlighting the depth of the talent and vibrancy of the tech community in Chicago and telling that story on a national basis, which is part of the reason we took this trip. I think we've got to really drill down and talk about the nuts and bolts of why our tech community is so vibrant and what the opportunities are for us, and then tell that story about quality of life. So those are some of the themes that came out of that. And then I think work more with our local tech community to build that pipeline and make sure that that pipeline is diverse. One of the things that we're very focused on as part of our economic recovery coming out of COVID is making sure that we leave no one behind. No neighborhood, no zip code, no demographic. We want to make sure that our recovery is as inclusive and equitable as possible.
So any early response from homegrown Chicago residents so far? Have you gotten positive reception on this plan?
We got a very, very positive reception from literally everybody that we met with. A lot of offers from different companies to help us get that story out. And I think we pricked the consciousness of some folks who are taking a look at, well, do I really need to be here, meaning the West Coast, in order to do what I want to do? I think the thing that makes us unique is this is a town of incredible innovation. On a lot of different fronts, not just in our tech community, but innovation and collaboration like never before, because really that was what was needed during COVID. So I think we've caught the attention of a lot of folks, and I want to make sure that we keep our graduates, particularly our engineers, home in Illinois and in Chicago. So I think we're well on our way.
Mayor Lori Lightfoot of Chicago, thank you so much for joining us. Great to hear about the plan. Coming up, Jeff Bezos sends a message to future astronauts as the billionaire prepares to blast off to the edge of space. Details next. This is Bloomberg. Jeff Bezos is giving $200 million to the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum days before he heads to space. The bulk of the gift going to create the Bezos Learning Center and the rest going to the museum's renovation. It is the largest single donation received by the museum since the original founding gift from James Smithson in 1846. Coming up, 15 years since the premiere of Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth. Now, he's warning that greenwashing may stop the climate fight in its tracks. He's with us next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. Let's take a quick look at what's moving in the markets today. Our Kriti Gupta has the latest. Kriti, what are you tracking?
Well, Emily, let's just start off macro here because you saw kind of a mixed picture for tech this morning. You saw S&P 500 up just 0.1%, and that's because only big tech rallied, but the rest of the market really kind of crashed lower. This, of course, coming after PPI prices and, of course, in anticipation of that Chairman Powell testimony today. Of course, you are seeing the Golden Dragon Index lower, and the reason I bring this to your attention, Emily, is because that was rallying yesterday, bringing up that New York FANG Index, bringing up those tech shares. Today, it's coming right back down, that regulatory scrutiny weighing on those shares. I do want to show you, switch to Apple, though, coming back to tech here in the States. The New York FANG Index and Apple really mirroring each other. In fact, Apple driving the gains in the New York FANG Index, and today is no exception, with Apple hitting a record high. You can see that on the right side of the chart there, and this really spilled over into other big tech stocks too, from Microsoft to Amazon to, of course, you have your Google as well, and this is really what helped the New York FANG Index higher. But Emily, it did not bring the rest of the market with it. Big tech was a sole outperformer today.
All right, Kriti Gupta, thanks for the roundup. Now, sustainable investing is booming, to meet the climate crisis. But there are growing concerns that too much attention is focused on measuring sustainability rather than advancing investments that make an impact. This is a key finding in Generation Investment Management's 5th annual sustainability report. Joining us now to talk about it is chair and co-founder of Generation Investment Management and former Vice President Al Gore. Mr. Vice President, thank you so much for joining us today. We are here 15 years after you helped the world wake up to the climate crisis with an inconvenient truth. Today, are you feeling optimistic or pessimistic that the crisis will be averted?
Well, thank you for having me on, Emily. Overall, I'm optimistic because we have seen a banner year in 2020 for sustainability. There is a threat of greenwashing, and it needs to be monitored. It needs to be dealt with. The new chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission just started taking steps here in the U.S., and similarly, we've seen some concern expressed elsewhere. It really needs to be dealt with. But overall, there has been an enormous increase, a tripling of sustainability-related financing flows since 2015. And flows into ESG funds have had a tenfold increase since 2015. And 3/4 of the global economy now is in nations that are under net zero commitments. Last year, if you look at new electricity generating power plants around the world, 90% of those built last year were solar and wind. And there are lots of similarly encouraging examples. But some of these commitments are for net zero by 2050, which is good, but commitments that will mature when all of the executive teams and all of the political leaders involved are long gone from the scene leave a little bit to be desired. So the focus is shifting toward near-term goals with a 50% reduction by 2030, just 9 years from now. And a lot of companies are making similar commitments, but you've got to pull back the top layers and look more deeply, because some of the companies that are making these commitments don't include their full emissions, the so-called Scope 3 emissions, which for large companies is the bulk of them. And some of the ones that make the 2050 commitments don't include 2030 commitments, which is really the key.
So your report flags greenwashing, as you mentioned, as a big issue, which is basically misleading the public about just how green your company and your products are. How do we address this?
Well, as I say, the SEC is beginning to take steps, and regulators elsewhere are beginning to look more closely at this. But investors have to play a key role as well. And now that we are seeing this dramatic shift into the sustainability revolution, and by the way, at Generation, we believe that we're in the early stages of a global sustainability revolution that has the magnitude of the industrial revolution coupled with the speed of the digital revolution. And we're seeing transformative changes in almost every sector of the economy. And that's very, very encouraging. But investors who want to participate in this have to take care to identify the risk of greenwashing. You know, you saw recently, or heard and saw, the lobbyist for ExxonMobil admitting, I guess he didn't realize the circumstances of the videotape, but he just admitted what many of us have long known, that there's just been a lot of highly cynical greenwashing at ExxonMobil. And if you look at the other large oil and gas companies, most of them do not include the full range of emissions in their pledges to go to net zero. And some of them just focus on becoming a little bit more efficient in producing more oil and gas, and they just ignore the consequences of how the oil and gas is used. And that's an example of greenwashing. The European Commission took a look at this and found on EU websites a very large percentage of these pledges and statements were misleading. And so it's a buyer beware. We really have to crack down on this. And again, investors have a role to play.
So let's talk about the investment, where it's happening. Is it happening in the right places? What are the most important trends you'd call out in terms of where the money is going?
Well, I mentioned one of them with electricity generation, 90% last year was solar and wind, and the International Energy Agency projects that in the decades going forward, it's going to be 95% solar and wind. So the fossil fuel companies are losing that market. They realize that. Next in line is mobility. Electric vehicles are really beginning a big surge. They will fall below the price of their internal combustion engine counterparts next year in important model categories, and in the next 2, 3, 4 years in all model categories. So they're losing that market as well. And the risk of stranded assets is growing, by the way. You remember, of course, the subprime mortgage crisis, which created the credit crisis and the Great Recession. Well, there are $22 trillion worth of in this subprime carbon bubble, where there may be an enormous bubble of stranded assets there. One of the problems, Emily, is that the financing for these mature sectors like electricity generation and mobility, building retrofits, the financing is not going to the developing countries in the volumes that are necessary. More political risk, higher interest rates, and the multilateral development banks, including the World Bank and regular banks, need to revise their approach and stop financing these dirty fossil fuels that kill people and create worse global warming, and direct more of the flow toward these exciting opportunities of the future that are already. Electricity is cheaper from solar and wind, and drivers prefer the electric vehicles. We can see where this is going, but the finance flows need to anticipate this change more than they are now.
Have you personally talked to President Biden about climate, and what have you discussed?
Oh, sure. I mean, he's been a friend for decades, and yes, I have. I don't ever talk about conversations that are in private with a president of the United States. I kind of got into that habit when I was VP, and I've kept it. I didn't talk about my conversations with President Trump. I'll tell you, they didn't go as well as the conversations with Joe Biden. I think he's doing a terrific job. And I think the agreement announced to include so many, a huge climate agenda in this pending reconciliation bill is yet another sign of the leadership he's providing.
So on that note, Democrats are proposing a carbon border adjustment tax in their budget. What do you think? Does it have legs?
Well, I'm all in favor of that, because if a nation like ours, for example, takes steps that account for the carbon pollution, and then some other country says, no, we don't pay any attention to that, there ought to be a border adjustment. The European Union is moving aggressively in that direction. I think that is the way to go. I know it's a point of dialogue between the U.S. and the European Union, but count me in favor of the carbon border adjustments.
So given what you dealt with as vice president, what is your advice to this administration with so many swings and misses in the past on climate? They've got control of Congress, but by a very thin margin. How do you get Republicans on side? How do you make climate action irreversible so we can avoid what happened under Trump?
Well, I think there are some important changes since the days when I was in the White House. First of all, perhaps most important, the climate crisis itself is now producing these incredibly dangerous, destructive, climate-related extreme events. As we're having this conversation, Emily, people are being evacuated from 60 large fires in the U.S. The fire season started earlier than last year's record season. We saw the hundreds of deaths in Oregon from the heat wave last week. A beautiful little town in Canada, 121 degrees, and then the next day destroyed by fire. Lake Mead is at the lowest level since the Hoover Dam was built, and they started filling the lake. The entire West is in a mega drought. You saw the videos of people walking through water up to their waist in the New York City subway stops. And there are similar tragic events all over the world. It's incredible what's happening, and I think it has awakened people to the urgency of this. And so I think the political environment is different. You're right that the resistance among Republicans is still high. They're still enthralled to the former president and, this nonsense that the climate crisis, they have a view of it that's separated from reality. However, Democrats have the opportunity in the Senate to use this so-called reconciliation procedure, which allows them to do it even if they don't get Republican votes. And of course, the House has majority rule, so it can pass there as well. But I would also point this out. On 65 college campuses in the U.S., the young Republican clubs have joined together to petition the Republican National Committee to change its position on climate, lest they lose that entire generation. And just last week, some 60 Republican members announced a new Republican organization devoted to climate. I don't know how far they're willing to go, but it's a good first step. And I hear from my Republican friends that, they want elected officials in both parties to move on this. Vast majority of Republican voters in the U.S. are in favor of bold action on climate now.
Now, China's carbon footprint still dwarfs the rest of the world. And speaking of politics, with what seems to be the decoupling of the U.S. and China happening right now, how optimistic are you that China will do its part?
Well, just today, China announced that it is going to launch its long-awaited carbon markets initiative, starting with power plants, but it's scheduled to expand throughout their economy. They're going to launch it on Friday. President Xi Jinping surprised the world last fall by announcing a net zero goal for China, 2060, which is a little bit too far out. And I hope that by the Glasgow conference at the end of this year on climate, the most important climate conference since the Paris Agreement, I hope that they'll bring that goal closer to the present day. They've built more solar and wind than the rest of the world put together, electric vehicles, electric buses, smart trains, long-distance DC cables, but they're still building as much coal capacity as the entire rest of the world put together. So they do need to do more. But the dialogues between the Biden White House and President Xi's team, John Kerry's doing a great job facilitating that. They have been going in the right direction. And I'm hopeful that China will take more aggressive steps. And in the lead up to Paris, it was China and the U.S. together that made that a success. I'm hoping that history will repeat itself with the Glasgow conference.
Now, Richard Branson just went up into space. Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk think we need to be able to live in space and perhaps even on Mars in order for the human race to survive a disaster. I'm curious, what do you think of these efforts and space or Mars as Plan B?
Well, I'm all for exploration, and I hear those who say, let's concentrate on planet Earth. But I would remind everybody that our ability to understand and deal with the climate crisis depends very heavily on space-based assets. Generation has helped to finance this new Climate Trace initiative, which is using existing satellite constellations and a lot of internet data streams to later this year identify the significant sources of greenhouse gas pollution all over the world. So it's not as if we have to choose. I understand that debate, but I remember back when I was young and the Apollo program was going on, I was always so excited about it. And I congratulate Richard Branson, wish Jeff Bezos well, and Elon Musk is already out there doing amazing things. And he has, all three of them, by the way, have been big allies and supporters of solving the climate crisis. And I want to give them kudos for that. All three of them have.
Now, speaking of, as you know, this is a technology show. We cover companies like Apple and Amazon and Microsoft, which are the three biggest tech companies, I should say, in the world. They've all laid out their sustainability plans. And I'm curious, do you think big tech is doing enough?
Well, I think, first of all, I'm on the board of Apple, so you will have to forgive me if I'm a little bit biased. I'm very proud of what Tim Cook and his executive team, especially Lisa Jackson, have done in reaching 100% renewable energy for the company's operations and soon for the entire global operations of Apple. Also Google and Microsoft. And Microsoft's gone the extra step to make a commitment to remove its legacy emissions. So I think that one of the keys is that consumer-facing companies are feeling the pressure from their customers, from their supply chain partners, certainly from their employees and executives and their families. And I think that's one of the reasons why the executive teams who really want to do this anyway are finding that it's good business sense to do it for multiple reasons. And you know, there are now more than 300 large multinational companies that have pledged to go to 100% renewable energy. And by the way, those corporate power purchase agreements have played a significant role in expanding the amount of solar capacity and wind capacity in the world. Just take a moment and return to that statistic that 90% of all the new power plants in the world last year were solar and wind. That's incredible. This is one of the fastest transitions that we've ever seen in technology history. And we saw how the digital revolution disrupted so many sectors of the economy. The sustainability revolution is going to do that even more powerfully and just as rapidly.
Interesting, and to hear you compare it to the industrial and digital revolution. Former Vice President Al Gore, Mr. Vice President, thank you so much for taking the time. Great to have you.
Thank you, Emily.
All right, coming up, a welcome surprise for players of the blockbuster video game NBA 2K. Details next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back. Let's take a look at some of the other stories we have been following. Amazon has considered developing an Alexa-powered wearable device for kids. Bloomberg has learned the device would provide access to the company's children-focused content and would let parents communicate and monitor their children. It's unclear if the project actually moved forward. Amazon surveillance devices, of course, are continuing to face criticism by privacy advocates. And Take-Two Interactive has selected Candace Parker to appear on the cover of a special edition of its latest version of the blockbuster video game NBA 2K. The Chicago Sky forward is the first woman to be selected for the coveted role. It's a step that's 2 decades in the making for the company's best-selling basketball video game. The studio added female players only 3 years ago. Coming up, the debate over breaking up big tech. Next, we will delve into the arguments at play as some lawmakers renew calls for more regulation. That's next. This is Bloomberg. Big U.S. tech giants Apple, Amazon, Facebook, Google, and Microsoft make up 1/5 of the S&P 500. They also find themselves now the targets of legislative and legal efforts to disrupt the power they hold, as their products are used in nearly every aspect of our lives. This weekend, Bloomberg Technology presents a special program on the increased calls to break up big tech here in the United States. Here's Bloomberg's Brad Stone outlining the arguments at play.
When it comes to the complex issues around antitrust enforcement against U.S. technology companies, a good place to start is with Microsoft. In 1998, the U.S. Justice Department filed suit against the company, alleging it had violated parts of the Sherman Antitrust Act. The central issue was whether Microsoft, which had more than 90% share of the market for operating systems, was allowed to bundle its flagship Internet Explorer web browser software with Windows, thereby restricting competing web browsers like Netscape Navigator. Microsoft argued that bundling was the result of innovation, which was echoed by CEO at the time, Bill Gates, to Congress. The judge decided that Microsoft's dominance did constitute a monopoly, but when appealed, the ruling was eventually overturned. In the end, the DOJ settled with Microsoft, but the company's once dominant position in the tech industry was eclipsed by upstarts like Google and Facebook. Now, we see regulators and lawmakers bringing new antitrust arguments against big tech companies. We've just seen Amazon in the crosshairs, as DC Attorney General Karl Racine alleges that an Amazon policy that prohibits sellers from offering their products at a lower price on other websites is anti-competitive. And in December, we saw the FTC and 48 states sue Facebook over whether it crushed competition by essentially buying rivals like Instagram and WhatsApp. We've also got the Justice Department and more than a dozen state attorneys general investigating Google over how it operates its dominant search and ads businesses. And we've got Epic Games, which sued Apple over its App Store practices. That trial even put its two CEOs on the stand. In all of these antitrust cases, there's the issue of control over prices, fees, mergers and acquisitions, and whether big tech companies are exerting it fairly. The decisions in these ongoing cases could set real precedents that reverberate beyond the technology industry. So Silicon Valley and all of the business community is watching closely for the outcome. The future of the global economy will depend on it.
Our Brad Stone there. You can catch our special show, Red Lines, U.S. and Big Tech on Bloomberg Television throughout the weekend, starting 7 p.m. Friday, Wall Street time, 4 p.m. here on the West Coast. And that does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. I want to make sure you tune in tomorrow. We will be joined by two high-profile Silicon Valley insiders, Vinod Khosla of Khosla Ventures and Section 32 founder Bill Maris, formerly of Google.